Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 57, Scott's Scope,
where we talk all about Ridley Scott and all of his different kinds of genre filmmaking that he does, because he's just all over the place.
Yeah, so many different kinds of movies. And we could only pick 3 this week as per the completely arbitrary rules of this podcast. But yeah, arbitrary. I think there are 3 big ones that people know about, and they're all very, very different. But first, a little bit about Ridley Scott himself. He was born in 1937 in South Shields, England, and he is still working. This man does not know when to stop, but he's still putting out quality content. Think The Martian from a couple years ago. He studied at Royal College of Art in London and started doing film there. And his first feature film, The Duelists, won the Best Debut Film at Cannes in 1977. So starting off his career with a bang, literally with pistol dueling and also sword dueling. And then his first commercial success was 1979 with Alien. And we already did a whole episode about aliens, so you can go check that out in the archive. But what are we talking about this week, Alex?
So our first film of the week is going to be Blade Runner from 1982, which is based on Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? I'm assuming there's a question mark, by Philip K. Dick. And it was nominated for Best Art Direction and Visual Effects. It was kind of a flop on its release, but through the many cuts that it went through, it's right. Kind of gained a cult status as a very popular sci-fi film, and it's kind of become a touchstone for cyberpunk, and we're going to talk all about that when we get to that section. But what other films are we talking about this week, Jonathan?
Yeah, then we move on to Gladiator from 2000, which kind of on the other end of the scale swept the Oscars, won Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Costume Design, Best Sound Design, and Best Visual Effects. So from Blade Runner in a very futuristic and gritty setting, we go to Gladiator, which is set in ancient Rome. So again, we're already seeing that scope there. And then we bring it to the modern day with our last film.
Yeah, our last film of the week is going to be Black Hawk Down from 2001, which is based on a book of the same name by Mark Bowden, which is based on the actual Battle of Mogadishu, which took place in 1993. And Mark Bowden used real-life testimony of the soldiers who were there to write his book, and those same soldiers and people who were there were used to help make the movie itself. And at the Oscars, it won for Best Sound and Best Editing.
All right, but let's jump back into the future and go to the past with a classic sci-fi film set in the future. In the future, there are androids that are fueled by artificial intelligence, and they are virtually indistinguishable from humans. They're called replicants. And there are law enforcement officers, like a special branch of the law enforcement called Blade Runners, who, after certain things have happened that really don't matter, basically replicants are feared and basically endangered at this point on Earth. They're illegal, and so the Blade Runners, their whole job is to find replicants and destroy them. So we follow a man named Deckard, played by Harrison Ford, who is a Blade Runner, and he is given the mission to track down 4 replicants, I believe, 3 or 4 replicants.
4 replicants.
And then destroy them. So basically we follow his journey through this and his relationship with another replicant who is kind of the assistant to the guy who's the head of the company that builds the replicants. And she starts having this whole identity crisis because she didn't know she was a replicant, and figures it out, and then starts building this relationship with Harrison Ford and is trying to get protection from him, even though his job is to destroy them. So there's that tension going on. And really, it just becomes this huge conversation about at what point does identity become personhood, and how much is a man-made creation, can it still be its own being and entity, and all these kind of things, and where do emotions come into all that? And it's really fascinating, and it's all wrapped in this cloak of neo-noir, which we've talked a lot about. And we put neo-noir in the future with robots. And there you've got Ridley Scott in a nutshell.
All right. So when we talk about Blade Runner, we kind of have to talk about one of those sleeper successes that have come up time and time again on this podcast and just tend to happen throughout cinema history. Those movies that don't do very well at first, but kind of gather a cult following or a widespread following and become popular classic movies over the span of decades rather than the span of weeks or months. And Blade Runner is definitely one of those cases because the theatrical release was it was not popular. And I haven't seen it, but I haven't heard a lot of great things about it. I know a lot of people like it, but I'm not.
One of the defining features about the theatrical cut, and I believe I did see the theatrical cut when this film was on Netflix for a while, several years ago. But one of the things that got a lot of pushback from that, I think, was Harrison Ford's voiceover, because again, like I just said, this film is kind of neo-noir, so it's kind of built around this idea of we're following this gritty detective going on this thing, and the femme fatale thing going on and everything. And so Harrison Ford has a lot of narration throughout it, kind of in the way that old noir films would do when you go into the detective's office and he's thinking to himself. But Harrison Ford, as much as I love him as an actor, he did not pull off that kind of Humphrey Bogart swagger. And so I can see why that is definitely a big thing that got cut out of the original release of the film.
Yeah, it just did not make it work. The ending was a lot different in the original release. It doesn't have Deckard and Deckard is kind of just not involved with the femme fatale at the end of the film. Essentially, I don't want to spoil the Blade Runner for you guys, but he's not involved at the end of with her at the end of the film. Whereas something does happen between them at the end of the film in the director's cut and definitive cut. So that was the theatrical release, and it wasn't very popular. It was kind of odd. It didn't seem to quite work. Later, there would be a home video release that came pretty soon afterwards. And that one added, I think, the unicorn dream sequence. And it added some extra gore when our chief bad guy, except I'm not really sure he's a bad guy, but our chief replicant of the film gouges out the eyes of the head of the company who made them.
I love how you introduced the question of whether he's the bad guy or not as you describe the most graphic part of the film.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Keep it complicated, Jonathan. Keep it complicated.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the home video release, and then the way that the voiceover gets dropped from the equation is a little interesting. There's a theater in the LA area called like the New Beverly Theater or something along those lines, New Beverly Cinema, something like that. And it was doing a screening of this film, but it was sent the wrong cut. It was sent a work print, which didn't have the voiceover inserted yet, and it was received much better by the audiences. The audiences loved it without the voiceover. So Ridley Scott comes back a few years later and decides to do a director's cut, which takes out the voiceover and changes the ending and leaves in the unicorn dream sequence. And that's the director's cut. So at this point, we're on like our fourth version of the film. And then the fifth version is either called the final cut or the definitive cut, something along those lines. And it's the director's cut, but with a color grade on it. And color grade technology kind of became popular around the turn of the century, around 2000. I think the first film to be fully color graded for a theatrical release on a computer was Oh Brother, Where Art Thou by the Coen brothers. So around that time, color grading is really becoming a big thing. And that's awesome because that's what I do for a living, but also it becomes a big thing for Ridley Scott, and he does it for the definitive cut of Blade Runner. And as we'll see when we talk about Gladiator and Black Hawk Down, it becomes a big part of his storytelling, is having these really heavy skews on his films that really set the tone with color, as well as all of the other ways we've talked about to set tone in a feature film on this podcast so far.
Yeah, because what we're going to see, I think, is that Ridley Scott, no matter what genre or time period that he's working in, he's an atmospheric director. He builds a feeling and he uses all of the tools at his disposal to do that. And obviously, the visual element is one of the major ways that film is able to convey that. And you can see that through all of his films, whether it's a romantic comedy or whether it's a gritty, futuristic neo-noir. But one thing I want to mention before we move away from the different versions is that in the original release, one of the other things that it had, which was later cut, is Deckard and the replicant that he's involved with kind of have this driving off into the sunset kind of moment where the last thing we see is these aerial shots of a car driving through country. They kind of gotten away from the city where all these terrible things have happened. But those shots that were used at the end of the film were actually unused clips taken from The Shining. Literally Stanley Kubrick's footage from The Shining of the car driving to the Overlook Hotel that they kind of doctored up and put in the movie.
Which I haven't seen, but it sounds really incongruous.
Yeah, it's and I remember I have this vision in my head of seeing that end scene and kind of being really confused at the end, and I think that part has a voiceover over it too. And when I watched this one, it ended so well that I was just like, I was like, "What did that actually happen? Did I see that before?" But yeah, that's actually part of it, and it comes from The Shining, which we've already talked about on the show before. So that's a fun tie-in.
Yeah. Let's plug more of our episodes, Jonathan. Let's do that.
Okay,
I think people love it when we plug our episodes.
So let's go back to the Cyberpunk episode, Alex.
Oh gosh, we did do a Cyberpunk episode.
We did do a Cyberpunk episode,
but it was anime.
With some Japanese anime films. But this film fits into that same category in the fact that it's a dystopian future. It's dark and gritty, very colorful lights, and just crazy things happening. It's kind of this technological cautionary tale, and that's what a lot of the other films that we watched in that episode, like way back at the beginning of the podcast, were all about. And so it's just, it fits right in that genre. Alien kind of does too, a little bit, except it's not so focused on the technology. It's just very noir and dark and gritty. And the technology is not bright and shiny. It's all like very gritty, realistic, like somebody took a computer and stuck it in the dashboard of a car and sent it into space kind of thing.
That's what I do every weekend.
And not like an iPad, like an old CRT TV, and they just stuck it in a dashboard.
Yeah. Actually, if you have seen Alien, I think Alien and Blade Runner are back to back actually in Ridley's canon. But
yeah.
Also, I have this problem where, for whatever reason, I think Ridley is Ridley Scott's last name because Ridley is a last name and Scott is a first name. So it leads to this weird problem where I keep calling him Ridley, like I'm on a first name basis with him, but I'm not. And I promise that. And I'm sorry if I've offended anybody. I'm trying. But it's this nice, Ridley Scott does kind of develops his own cyberpunk style, his own sci-fi style between Alien and Blade Runner that's very similar. The way the keyboards click and clack, the way the monitors run programs on the screen in this big green font, the way that everything's in like terminal mode on the computer, which we have to say is a side effect of it being a 1980s film, and that's just what computers were like in the 1980s. But right. It's showing the way you show it on film, the way you show contemporary technology on film, it can be done in so many ways. Just looking at how we do contemporary technology nowadays in film, do you show a text by showing the phone screen, or do you just show it as an overlay like they do in Sherlock? And Ridley kind of develops his own way of showing 1980s technology that is pretty consistent between Alien and Blade Runner, and shows his own style there, even though they're both sci-fi films, and they have that Ridley touch. They end up being quite different. But, it's a nice way, even though it's going to be a challenge today because we're tracking Ridley Scott through 3 different genres, but we're going to notice that he has very similar techniques and styles and Ridley Scott-isms that stick out between all of his work.
Yeah. So, I mean, all of these, you kind of have to, we can't really avoid talking about other films that we're not specifically covering today, because we haven't really covered a director like this before who's so diverse. Usually we try and pick ones who have a fair amount of consistency throughout their work, but Ridley Scott is just really a genre chameleon. And even just talking about like the different ways that he can portray sci-fi coming to a more contemporary point in his career. If you look at The Martian, which is also sci-fi, but it's got a much cleaner look to it and feel to it, and it's very down to earth, because one of the points of the movies is like, this could actually happen. If we're going back to Ray Bradbury's distinction, Blade Runner and Alien are science fantasy, and The Martian is like hard sci-fi. Like, this is a thing that could actually happen in the foreseeable future. Even
Blade Runner is not based off of any real technology besides computers.
No. But one thing I do want to talk about as far as the differentiation between Blade Runner and Alien is that Blade Runner has a little bit more of that fantastical element to it, at least in the story presentation aspect. Just the fact that the film starts off with this great shot of an eye and all of these city lights, like just hundreds of lights, and then this fire that's bursting up like from a factory smokestack. It just really sets a tone for this whole movie that
welcome to hell.
A little bit, but it's also the nice blues and oranges, like you're talking about, that color grade and everything. It puts this whole fantasy element to it, and then not to mention, like you said, the unicorn dream sequence and stuff like that. It's like, this is sci-fi, but it's also very much atmospheric, and it's like it's building this feeling of just kind of this gritty world that has something else going on behind the scenes. And I don't really know how to describe it, but it's this feeling that Ridley Scott is able to convey by combining all of these images together.
Yeah, and Ridley Scott, I think in this movie, I would have to do some really wide research to figure this out, but he is kind of pioneering the low hum score that's become very popular in recent years. Kind of not the big whomp that you hear in Inception, but but
like Arrival.
Yeah, but like the low hum. You're not necessarily hearing music, but you're hearing a rumble that sets you on edge. And certainly, if you're actually viewing it in a proper theater experience, you can feel in your chair. And it's a nice way to kind of reach out to the audience physically as well as, audio visually. All right. And before we move on from Blade Runner, we should bring up the fact that there has pretty recently been a Blade Runner sequel, Blade Runner 2049, which is literally labeled the year that the movie takes place, which is helpful for continuity purposes, I guess. But it does follow the same story, and it follows the same story from the definitive cut and the director's cut, which have the same story between the two of them. And I don't want to spoil the plot, but it's quite good. I enjoy it. If nothing else, it's drop dead gorgeous. Roger Deakins won an Oscar for cinematography for it. Finally won an Oscar. He's done so much great work, and he finally got it. And I'm glad he won it on this one. It's some of his best work. It's really great. Especially if you're interested in some of the bigger philosophical questions that are at play in the original Blade Runner, that are hinted at and toyed with and are kind of left for you to think about after you leave the theater, but aren't explored as in depth, then this movie is for you. Blade Runner 2049. They go hard into those philosophical questions, and what does it mean to exist, and what does it mean to think you exist? What is it called?
I am programmed, therefore I am.
That versus I think, therefore I am. How do those hold up in this fantasy, science fantasy world where this replicant technology and implanted memories are possible? And of course, that's kind of touched on in the original Blade Runner, and I kind of hinted at this before, but let's touch on it before we go, Jonathan. Is this question of who's the good guy in this movie? Is it Deckard? Is it? He's kind of like
He's
hunting and killing these people. He's the protagonist for sure. He's the one who's kind of acting, and we follow him around the story, and he's causing things to happen. And we definitely know the replicants are the main four replicants are kind of the antagonists because they're working against him. So that's it from a story perspective. But, you know, if you look at it from the replicant perspective, you know, like they've been programmed to die, and they've been treated as slaves their entire life, and they're fighting it back against this order, and they just want somebody to fix the programming that is in their cloned cells to make sure they can have a regular lifespan. And, you know, they do a couple bad things, and by that I mean I think a couple murders, but you know that's no worse than what Deckard does over the course of the film.
Or is it? And that's kind of the whole question. But it goes into like what we talked about with anti-heroes in our Hitchcock series, as far as yes, Deckard is the protagonist, but as we go, we're made to question whether he is the hero or not. And whether the replicants are the villains or not, because for most of the film, we believe that they are the villains. I'm going to get into spoiler territory here for a little bit, so just skip a little bit ahead if you don't want to hear it. But, you know, really, it's not until the very end when the replicant saves him that we realize what is going on inside of them. We don't realize that they are developing the full range of emotions and not just this vengeance against humanity for creating them and then trying to destroy them again. So yeah, there's so many things going in underneath the scene, like behind the scenes and within the subtext of this film, that is one of the reasons that I think it kind of leaves you with a lot of questions the first time you see it, and then it kind of you start to think about it, and I think that's one of the reasons that is sort of grown in popularity over time as well. So yeah, there's a lot that goes on there, and I mean those are questions that neo-noir has dealt with for a long time. Like neo-noir rarely has a solid protagonist. They're usually anti-hero stories, and this one falls into that, but also, you know, leaves a lot of things up in the air, because if you consider the replicants as just machines or just robots or androids or whatever, then Deckard is just kind of, you know, he's shutting down a computer. But if you see them as fully, you know, full beings with every right that humans do, then he becomes more of a villain. So it's all of that stuff wrapped up in this film.
Yeah, and if nothing else, then the antagonist and protagonist are well juxtaposed and well aligned, which always makes for a great film and makes for a nice stick with you film after you leave the theater, where they have maybe not necessarily opposing views, because I don't think Deckard has a super solid view, like he's questioning the entire film.
He's just kind of doing his job.
Yeah, they have something to teach each other, or at least ask each other, that is of significance. Like when the bad guy has at least a bit of a point, or the antagonist has at least a bit of a point or something to teach the protagonist over the course of the film, then the film can't be all bad. Like it's a good formula to work a film off of, and it works in Blade Runner. And it definitely leads to maybe one of the most cerebral pieces of work out of Ridley Scott's canon. Because certainly I don't think Gladiator kind of hits that mark, and Black Hawk Down, I mean, it deals with some stuff, but not nearly as deeply as Blade Runner does.
Yeah, it makes its point pretty clearly.
Yeah, we're gonna probably leave the cerebral stuff behind as we move forward.
Yeah, but the last thing to bring up with Blade Runner, just going into all the cerebral stuff, is all of those things we were talking about get even more complicated when you throw in the question that people have been asking since the movie came out, which is Deckard a replicant himself, which is like very subtly implied throughout the film. And people debated it ever since it came out. The new film actually answers that question, and Ridley Scott has answered that question. But we won't get into that here. You can go look that up for yourself.
Yeah. We only spoil like 90% of the things we talk about on the podcast. We leave 10% for you to find out.
Judicial spoiling.
All right. So now on to our second film of the episode, Gladiator.
Wait, Alex.
What?
We have a 1.5 movie to throw in there.
Okay,
and that
Steve
is
Jobs.
that is a credit on Ridley Scott's IMDb page that we could not pass up, which is titled The Apple 1984 Commercial, which I'd actually seen in class before, because film classes like to show different examples of storytelling, and when they're a minute long, that is prime territory.
I read about it in the Steve Jobs book.
There you go. It is really a classic commercial. It's listed among the 50 greatest commercials, and basically Ridley Scott created this commercial for Apple set in the world of George Orwell's 1984, just kind of like through the atmosphere, and then disrupts it. And that is how Apple introduced their first Macintosh. And it's really great. And it actually came out in 1984. And the tagline of the commercial is, "The Macintosh will be released, and you will see why 1984 won't be like 1984, except for all the things that Apple has done since then to parallel our world to George Orwell's."
Yeah, face recognition on the new phone. That's a great idea.
Anyway, we just wanted to throw that in there. I'll put a link to the actual commercial in the blog post so you can go check it out. So Ridley Scott has that going for him as well.
Oh, right. Okay. So on to our next film of the episode, Gladiator from 2000, which I would say is appropriate for me to talk about, considering that I'm the history buff out of the two of us, Jonathan.
Yeah, that's accurate.
Except that I want to get this out of the way real quick. And I'm going to try very hard throughout the podcast to not rag on any historical inaccuracies that we see in Gladiator, because this is not really a historical piece. It's not, it kind of is. It's not a documentary. That's the point I want to get across. It's not about conveying the accuracy of a period, even though it is a period piece. It's set in a very different time, in a very different place, with a very different culture. It's a historical fantasy. It's almost like a what if, like an alternate history. Think one of them that's very popular right now is The Man in the High Tower. Like, what if the Allies lost World War II? And
Men in the High Castle, which is actually Philip K. Dick story.
There you go, Philip K. Dick tie-in. And you, I got the title wrong, so there's that. Lots to go around. But Gladiator kind of falls into that camp, especially considering the ending of the film, which I'm going to try not to talk about, but we'll kind of get up close to that point. So this film kind of combines the political intrigue of films like Julius Caesar with the gladiator, all-out fightitude of films like Spartacus. In fact, this film draws a whole heck of a lot from Spartacus.
So, Alex, real quick, what would you consider the difference between a historical fantasy and a historical fiction like Shakespeare's Julius Caesar or Henry Triad or whatever?
Okay, so a historical fantasy is kind of posing a what-if question. And the what-if question in Gladiator is going to be, what if Marcus Aurelius didn't actually appoint Commodus as emperor? And that's actually, like, from a historical standpoint, that's a big question. A lot of people ask themselves that because in retrospect, it was a very bad idea. Don't do that. But a historical drama, or a more accurate historical period piece, would have been charting the events as they happen, and just kind of dramatizing them, adding some extra intrigue, but the ending is still the same. Nothing departs dramatically from what actually happened in real life. So in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, what actually the plain facts of what happens over the course of the story and by the end of the story is, pretty much what happened in real life. Julius Caesar's assassin, Marcus Antonius denounces his rivals in the forum. The rivals run away, and then they all get killed on a battle in Greece between
Shakespeare's just able to put words in their mouths while all that's going on.
Yeah, and add thematic significance to these very dramatic this very dramatic story that everybody knows or is at least familiar with from history. Now, a very different a historical fantasy might have been if, Julius Caesar came back from the dead as a zombie and then started a zombie plague. It would have been very, very different.
Julius Caesar and zombies.
Oh, gosh, like Pride and Prejudice and zombies?
Right.
I want to see that. I'm not going to write it, but I'm just throwing that out there to the audience. Consider it. Email me your copy. Anyway.
Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your brains.
Oh gosh. Gosh, we already have lines.
We are getting this done.
We have a subtitle. We have a pitch. Julius Caesar and zombies. Okay, so anyway, that's kind of the difference between historical fantasy and historical drama. Historical drama dramatizes events but kind of keeps them as they happened, at least the broad strokes of it. And historical fantasy kind of takes the opportunity to say what if and take dramatic turns from what actually happened. For instance, was there a gladiator or a general named Maximus? There were a lot, but not the one that we saw in the film. In fact, I saw this one this week. I had seen it before, but it essentially goes into depth to say that Maximus isn't a first name in Rome. So Maximus wouldn't be a first name. It would be like a last name, but often you would call somebody by their last name. So like if we were in Rome right now, I'd be calling you Satchel and you'd be calling me Geringer, except that we were friends, like we're close. So I would call you Jonathan and you would call me Alex. But like if a stranger walked up to us, they would call us Geringer and Satchel, or Satchel and Geringer, not to take preeminence. But yeah, so there's a lot of stuff like that. I don't want to, we could spend hours and hours talking about it, and it's kind of interesting to get into, but it's not really important to the film at hand because that's not what Ridley Scott decided to do. He decided to take the fantastical approach, and the writers decided to take a fantastical approach with this film. And that's what they did. And the plot does focus around the end of the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor of Rome, the last of what you call the five good emperors who handed off power to his son, Commodus, after defeating the Germans in Germania, north of Rome, with his army led by the general Russell Crowe or Maximus, depending on who you ask, at the end of the Marcomannia Wars. So that's where our movie starts, and the movie starts with a big battle, and Russell Crowe is kicking butt and riding in the cavalry, which wasn't a thing, I'm sorry. But yeah, they kick butt, they kick the Germans' butt, and Marcus Aurelius is like, yay, we kicked the butt, and we kicked the German butt. And his kids are coming up from Rome. He's asked them up from Rome because Marcus Aurelius is dying and he needs to get his succession plan in place. And his son Commodus is expecting to be named emperor because, well, that's how it worked. But Marcus Aurelius has a surprise for everybody. He wants to restore the Roman Republic, which makes absolutely no sense, but whatever. He wants that, and that kind of becomes a big theme of the movie, is restoring the rightful Roman Republic. It has these big democratic, libertarian overtones to the film. Give power to the people. Everybody in Western civilization nowadays can get behind that. So it makes it super relatable. We all root for Maximus because he's given the task by Marcus Aurelius to restore the empire. He doesn't really want it. He just wants to go home. He's like, okay, fine, whatever, I'll take it. Commodus finds out about this and then kills his dad, Marcus Aurelius. So the emperor's dead, and pretends that it was natural causes, and then proclaims himself emperor, and the army accepts that. But Maximus doesn't because he knows his orders, and he suspects that Commodus did, what he did and killed his dad. So Maximus is sentenced to execution. He's taken out to the woods by the Praetorian Guard, the guard of the emperor, and he's about to be killed, but then he fights his way off and runs away. He tries to run back to Spain to find his family, but when he gets there, he finds that his family has been viciously murdered by the emperor's agents, Commodus's agents. So now we kind of have the basis for a revenge plot, and right after this, Maximus is picked up by some slave traders and sold to a gladiator school in essentially the province of Africa, or probably Mauritania, which is like Morocco. And there we start kind of like our Spartacus plot, where he is trained to become a gladiator, and eventually he gets into it. He gets excited. He kind of gets caught up in it. This is where we have the meme, "Are you not entertained?" He gets really into it. Of course, he's great because he's a Roman general. He was trained. He's very good at killing. And he tells his owner, essentially Proximo, ex-gladiator turned gladiator fight runner, that he wants to go to Rome to meet the emperor. And of course, the emperor, who just became emperor, is throwing these lavish games to celebrate becoming emperor. And all these gladiators from all across the empire are going, and Maximus is one of those. He goes to the empire, or to Rome, and there we have a growing political plot between Maximus and his allies, his fellow gladiators. A couple senators get thrown into the mix, and Commodus, on the other hand, who wants to maintain power and doesn't want to be toppled over by a bunch of senators and gladiators who want to restore the republic. And of course,
the narrator from Henry V.
And the narrator from Henry V. And of course, the entire plot is kind of structured around a series of gladiator battles. Those tend to come at a fairly rhythmic pace over the course of the film in order to give it structure. And keep the audience interested. And in between, we get intrigue. We get a little bit of romance between Commodus's sister and Maximus, who we think maybe had a thing in the past. I don't know. It's a little obscure.
Yeah, there's a lot of implications.
Yeah, it gets very heroic towards the end, and I don't want to actually spoil the ending because we're trying hard to not do that anymore.
But one of the interesting things that is kind of thrown in to keep the political intrigue and the gladiator fights tied together is this element, this thematic element that kind of parallels the politics and the entertainment and the brutality of the entertainment with the brutality of politics, which is really interesting because it actually kind of, it takes the blockbuster, like, okay, he's fighting a lot of people and it's really bloody and well choreographed and everything, but it actually adds like another element. Like, at what point is politics just a game of winning fans, and at what point is entertainment actually, done with a purpose, and not just for entertainment? And can those things ever really be separated? So it has a lot of really interesting conversations that take it one or two levels beyond just a superficial blockbuster movie.
Yeah, that's true. And I one thing I want to point out structurally about the film is the fact that it starts out with this big battle before the Roman army proper, like the legions, the cream of the crop of the fighting world. There was no better fighting force in the time, type army, and the fierce German barbarians in the woods. And it's a very different type of battle than we see over the rest of the film, which are all these kind of like gritty, scrappy gladiator battles. It's shot a bit differently. It's shot in a lot of wide shots. There's a lot of slow-mo.
It's blue. Most of the other fights are in bright daylight with sand,
bright gold with this gladiator sand. You're right. The one in the Germanic woods is blue. Again, Scott Ridley, Scott Ridley. That's what his name should be. I'm sorry.
I know. It's like you've organized him in your file backwards.
It's like his parents messed up on the birth certificate and just put him in the wrong order.
Right.
Okay. I'm sorry. It's hard. Anyway.
They put Maximus as his first name on accident.
It's a Roman last name. Come on. Gosh, we're such nerds. Anyway. But yeah, again, he's hitting us hard with the color correction there. But, we start off with this battle and we're rooting for the Romans because, of course, you root for the Romans. It's exciting to see them conquer people. You're rooting for the empire. You're rooting for civilization. That's in quotes, by the way. And you're rooting for them to win over these crazy Germanic barbarians who cut off the head of the messenger and sent it flying back towards the other people. And you want them to win in this big, epic, glorious fight where there's clearly honor at play. And at the end of it, Maximus is really, really celebrated for not just for, providing entertainment, but for doing a service for for his empire and for his emperor and doing well. And you can tell how much he cares. There's a few lines in there about where Maximus actually lists off the specific number of casualties he had, both men killed and men wounded. And you can tell he cares about the men who are killed out there. And that is in juxtaposition to the vicious, bloodthirsty fights in the Gladiator ring, which are very entertaining, but have a different kind of moral significance to them, political significance to them, and are just shot differently, which is always something you should do if you're going to juxtapose two things in film. Work with the audiovisual medium so they look different. You don't get the same slow-mo that you got in the big Roman army fight at the beginning in the gladiator battles. You get much more concise cutting, much quicker paced, and it's you feel the impact a lot more. It doesn't feel like a story. It feels gritty and real.
Yeah, and in terms of, like you're saying, just being shot differently, and just to get in again a little bit into Ridley Scott's technical aspects of this film, which I think that we've talked about before, directors who are very actor focused, like Kenneth Branagh, versus very technical directors like Alfred Hitchcock. I think Ridley Scott falls on the technical side because in all of these films we're seeing a lot. He does a lot of very experimental editing and stuff like that. And in this film specifically, there are a lot of really interesting things where Russell Crowe is disoriented. We get these very jittery frame rates. We get freeze frames. We get time lapses. All like put together in this one montage. And there's just a lot of other things he does. He does several dream sequences or dream-like sequences that kind of take on this whole different look. I don't know if it's an infrared filter or what, but it kind of turns everything in this interesting dreamy blue look.
I think that might be my favorite look of the entire film. When he's imagining like Elysium and seeing his family again.
Yeah, it's really got an interesting look to it that you don't even see that much nowadays when we have so much range with what we can do as far as post-processing. But it struck me watching this film again, like how much he actually takes these leaps and does these really creative things that you don't think about. Like, sure, blockbusters do a lot of like crazy stuff goes on within them. But I was trying to think back to like the last time I'd seen someone just kind of take a jump and do some really crazy editing technique like that. And maybe Edgar Wright, but usually those are just different ways of combining shots rather than actually, combining the footage itself and throwing effects and stuff onto it. I don't know. It's just, it definitely has a feel to it. Like we were saying, Ridley Scott has his touch, even if it's not like a thematic through line throughout his career.
Yeah. And you know what? Sometimes his experimentation works really well. I think in Black Hawk Down, I really like it in Black Hawk Down. I think the editing he does in Black Hawk Down is phenomenal. In Gladiator, there's a couple bits that stick out to me as not so good. The one that really, really gets to me, and I think it's gotten to me the last few times, but I finally like kind of had the experience or breadth of film canon viewing to understand that I don't like it, is the sequence in the opening battle where Maximus is like, he loses his sword, like he swings at a barbarian and gets stuck in a tree. And the editing kind of retraces its steps for a little bit to make it really clear that the sword got stuck in the tree, but it looks like you're kind of going back and forth in time for a few seconds. I found it very disorienting. And maybe that's what he was going for, but that was one of the times where he kind of pushed the envelope, and I didn't think it worked as well. But of course, there's other times where he pushes the envelope and it works great. And that happens in Black Hawk Down a lot, where the editing is really percussive and it works great.
Yeah. And in Gladiator, we also see a lot of, and we see this in Blade Runner 2, is the way that he does lighting for certain scenes. He's really good at getting his lighting and just ambient haze and throwing that into a scene when needed and making it work really well. There's some great scenes at the end of Gladiator that have that. There's some great uses of it in Blade Runner, like in one of the very first scenes. He does it really well in his first film, The Duelists, where several of the frames just look like old Renaissance paintings. But yeah, again, it's that technical mastery of just making each image look really good for the piece that it is, for what it is, because Gladiator has a very different look than Blade Runner, but they're both very precisely crafted to fit the world that they belong to. And Black Hawk Down is extremely different from both of those movies, but it sets a tone just through the visual aspect, the visual coat of paint, if you will, that is put on every single frame of the film. But yeah, aside from, like we're talking about, some of the thematic things that go into the film, the just kind of basic, this film has kind of a more archetypical plot structure than like Black Hawk Down or Blade Runner. Blade Runner falls into a neo-noir category that can be a little bit, that is a little bit template for that genre. But Gladiator is kind of, classic revenge tale that almost goes back to like Homer, or think like Count of Monte Cristo. You've got your protagonist who is great, everybody loves him. Your jealous character has power to get rid of him and gets rid of him, but not completely. And then they're able to work their way back and through the journey of returning with this mindset of revenge, they have strengthened themselves in order to overcome the antagonist by the end of the film. I mean, even Lion King follows this structure. So I thought that was really interesting as far as these other two movies that have fairly unique storylines. And then Gladiator is Ridley Scott taking on one of the most classic tales, putting it in Rome and putting his own technical touch on it and making a really good movie that a lot of people were thoroughly pleased with, if the Oscars are any indication.
Right.
All right, so moving on to our final film of the episode, and back into a modern setting, we have Black Hawk Down, which is, as we said at the beginning of the episode, is based on a book, which is based on an actual event, which is a 1993 raid by the U.S. in Mogadishu. In a summary, a bunch of soldiers were sent to capture some people in Mogadishu. One of the helicopters ended up getting shot down, and then it became a rescue mission for those soldiers. And so there are soldiers trying to get these hostages out, and then other soldiers trying to go back in to rescue the soldiers who went down in the helicopter. Another helicopter goes down, and it just becomes this all-out kind of fight for survival. And throughout all of this, there's a little bit of this political commentary where basically the whole setting of this battle and all these things is kind of arbitrary, and putting that in contrast with how gritty and violent and realistic the depiction of war and of this war zone is, kind of puts this whole, it is definitely built to skew your bias against war of pretty much any kind, because it's so pointless and it's so violent, and it makes you feel every one of the injuries that the soldiers get, injuries and deaths, and so it takes war from being statistics to being real flesh and blood, and puts you in a very subjective position in terms of that. And there's a lot going on, but it's really kind of a simple structure other than that. And Ridley Scott is able to depict a lot of things very graphically, but in a very realistic way that definitely, it's a tough watch, but it definitely gets its point across.
Yeah, it's intense as heck, that's for sure.
Yeah.
If nothing else, I believe I read that this movie, or something that Ridley Scott said, was that this movie was supposed to be pro-military, but maybe anti-imperialistic, or at the very least apolitical. Like, it isn't necessarily trying to make the largest political point, but it is trying to support the men, and in this case just men, I guess, but in theory men and women in uniform, who, regardless of what the larger political story is, carry out their duty with honor and to the best of their abilities. And I think that's what's at the heart of this movie and what it's trying to get across. Not necessarily trying to make a bigger political statement, although there certainly is enough material here for you to do so.
Right.
Of course, I think that might just be a side effect of the fact that it's based off of a real event, and you can form your own political opinion off of the facts of that real event. But the filmmaking itself seems to be very sympathetic to the soldiers who we see just trying to do their job. Now, whether or not their job is a good one to do,
yeah,
I don't know that. But it's not really up to the soldiers to decide that. It's not at liberty for them to decide.
Kind of think the charge of the light brigade.
Yeah,
there's not a reason why.
There's just to do and die. And you see a lot of people doing things that they have to do, doing very heroic things over the course of this film in subpar circumstances, when stuff just keeps going from bad to worse and bad to worse and bad to worse, even down towards the end, where some of the poor soldiers, like, I can't remember how they ended up on foot, but they ended up on foot with no transportation, and they're just running back to the safe zone on foot with the enemy militia behind them, creeping up, which is actually something that actually happened. A lot of the stuff in here is stuff that actually happened. They called it the Mogadishu Mile, where they had to run back to safety.
Yeah, and the fact that, so the other thing about this film is it's very ensemble. So this is not like one or two protagonists. This is a ton of soldiers that we are seeing. We're seeing their interactions. We are hearing their thoughts. So we're seeing soldiers being very heroic, but we're also seeing their fears, their doubts, their mistakes, and none of them are like cowardly or anything, but these are people who, some of them have never been in war before, some of them have never been in this situation, and we're seeing them go through that and what it does to your psyche, how it changes your just fundamental beliefs about war and about trying to help people and what the cost of that is. And we've got very idealistic characters going through and coming out much more hardened, and we have characters that are very excited to go into war, and then they get injured, and it's not pretty. And there's sometimes it's kind of confusing because there are so many characters. And the interesting thing about the cast is that a lot of these actors went on to become quite famous after the fact. So there are faces that you recognize in there, like Ewan McGregor and Tom Hardy and Orlando Bloom and stuff like that, which actually kind of helped me keep some of these characters straight.
It's so hard, right?
I know, there's so many. They're all wearing the same uniform and everything, but yeah, it is,
okay. So they're not only are they all in the same uniform, but except for one of the characters, they're all white guys,
right?
And I don't know about you, but if you put a bunch of white guys in one movie, face blindness kicks in or something, and I cannot tell them apart, especially when they're all roughly the same age, roughly in good shape, have pretty short hair, to no hair, no facial hair, are all in uniform. Like, it gets difficult. You
usually get that sensation in black and white films, but there's just like so many variables taken out of the equation here.
Yeah. And I've wondered what the effect of this is on watching the film. And for me, to a certain respect, it almost makes it more sympathetic, because the soldiers become stand-ins. They become, instead of like every man, they're every soldier. Like, you don't have to go too into the specifics of one soldier's experience to sympathize with them. You just understand that it's hard because it's happening to all of these people who are in uniform. Now, over the course of the film, especially as some people start to die off and we see storylines develop and people get certain dirt on their dirt and blood on their uniforms,
injuries or whatever.
Yeah, it gets easier to tell what's going on. As people get separated, they split into groups. It gets a little easier to follow certain characters. But certainly, even when we get to the end and we go back to there being a bunch of white guys in a camp, you're left with the sense of every soldier mentality.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, you're right. If none of these actors had kind of become really big stars later on, and they just kind of all blended together, it would almost kind of add to that experience of, just having this, this is happening to all the soldiers at the same time. It's not necessarily this one. You're not trying to be connected to one or another. You're trying to see this collective experience, and just kind of, they're almost like, in a sense, they almost become just little personifications of different perspectives of soldiers, like as they come into war, go through it, and then what they are when they come out. And it's picking a bunch of different attitudes and the way that they change, and we're watching them all at the same time, but we're not being emotionally connected or like very specifically concerned with someone's arc from point A to point B to point C. It's point A, war, point C.
Yes, it's complicated. But I think at the end of the day, the meat of this, there's the larger story going on, there's larger sympathies going on, but what makes this an enjoyable film to watch, like what I would say is the reason that I'm going to go watch it again, is the really exciting action sequences. And I think I've complained quite a bit on this podcast before about guns. And this isn't even like a political thing. I'm just talking about their use in media. Like, throw a gun to the scene automatically, it's exciting. And it kind of just feels like, you have a character running around waving a gun is supposed to make it exciting. But in Black Hawk Down, they go a step further. The use of guns by our protagonist, by the U.S. soldiers, is very intentional, and two, percussive. Like, you feel it. The soundtrack, and two, the shot
like
coverage and the editing.
Not like in the way that Marvel movie trailers, where every gunshot literally hits a percussion beat in the trailer music.
No. I mean, like the actual the shape, the sound shape of the gunshot in the in the sound design is marvelous. And I believe we said this won Oscar for sound design or sound mixing or something like that.
Yeah,
but
sound design and editing.
It's well earned. It's well earned. The sound design and the editing make the gun sequences work. They're followable, even if I can't remember who any of the characters are. If you isolate any one sequence of the film, I can understand what's going on. And two, exciting. And not, you don't just have characters running around waving guns. You can tell they're doing stuff very purposefully. And that's what you want from characters, whether the decisions they're making are talking to people or saying certain things, or in this case, shooting certain people and shooting certain things. You want it to feel very deliberate, and you want what they do on screen to feel like choices and not just random action. Yeah,
but there's another element. I mean, we're just taking for granted the fact that the use of guns in this film is mandatory because we're covering a real life event of modern warfare. But we do get to see elements of using guns that we don't usually see in movies. We don't see in blockbuster movies a character going deaf because a gun was shot too close to his head. We don't see a character getting burned because hot shell casings are falling on top of them. These are like real just little moments in this film that put a realism on it, but also like you're saying, they help bring this use of guns to a point, like the fact that guns are dangerous more than just if it's being aimed at you. There are a lot of other elements, and I'm still really angry at Tom Hardy for making that guy deaf because it's just so stupid. But it's something that he also don't saved think his life
while doing it.
That's true. But he was told specifically not to shoot that gun right next to his head.
Yeah. I mean, like at that point, it was such a hot mess of a mission that, you know, I don't know. It just got very difficult.
Better your hearing than your southern half.
Yes, as some other people happened to some other people. Yes. This is something else I want to bring up in reference to this film, and that is the fact that it is based on real life events. And I think we've already talked about kind of how that impacts your political viewing of the film. You know, if you have a political idea of the real life events, then you're going to have a political idea of the events that you see in the film. It's very hard to separate that. But also, whenever you're viewing a film that is based on real life events and they're very intense, sad, people dying type events, then it kind of makes the viewing different. There's something nice about watching an action movie like Jason Bourne and knowing that when you walk out of the movie theater that everything you saw on screen was fake. Yeah. Knowing that all those actors are fine and dandy. Although I have a funny story about that in a second. But there's something different about watching this Black Hawk Down and knowing that, 19 to 20 people died that day on the American side of things, and like hundreds of Somali warlord militia died that day. Like, those are real events with real repercussions and real impacts. And Somalia as a country has been in a state of civil war since basically 1990, maybe a lot earlier, depending on your definition of civil war. And so as a piece of media, as a piece of military storytelling, it's fascinating and enjoyable and exciting. And yes, all of these actors walked away from that set fine and dandy. I could not tell you if they're all still alive. I don't know. But they didn't die in the course of making this movie. But, you know, I don't know. Something about knowing that the real life events are so sad sticks with you after the film the same way that the big philosophical questions of Blade Runner stick with you after the film.
Yeah, but this is different from other types of movies that we've talked about before, for like specifically documentaries and biopics, because it's kind of a biopic of an event and not a person, because it's not a documentary even in the Errol Morris sense, where it's kind of a recreation, but it's only a recreation, which doesn't lend it to the documentary category, and it doesn't follow a person and fictionalize them. It tries to stay pretty true to a real life event. And there are several other of these kind of movies. I don't know if they have like a subgenre title, but you know, Zero Dark 30 and 13 Hours and all that kind of stuff. And putting it on film in this kind of semi-narrative way. It's not like, again, it's not a story with a protagonist and an antagonist and this big story arc. It has a very logical, real life kind of an arc. But the way that you're able to, you know, take it out of the documentary space and then put a creative spin on it is where these films come into their own, and is where Ridley Scott puts his own touch on it, like we've been talking about with things like the color grade, where this film, the color grade is so contrasty. It is just like very punched, which is where basically you take your bright part of the image and you make it really bright, and you take your dark part of the image and make it really dark, to the point where there are a lot of things that just become silhouetted because they've crushed their blacks so much. Maybe
That's
I
color
should rephrase that.
That's color. So real quick, when we say that you've crushed the when we say crush the blacks, when we're talking about film, we're typically talking about color, unless you're just an asshole. We're talking about reducing the brightness value of a pixel in an image to or below 0%, so that it just shows up on screen as pure black. And when you do that, when you really, really ratchet or darken an image, you'll crush a lot of the blacks. It gives a really strong, contrasty look. It also takes out a lot of detail. So if somebody's wearing a black coat and you crush it, then you take out a lot of detail in the coat. But it can still look really good. So if you hear somebody say crushing the blacks, it probably means that.
As long in this context.
In this context. In the filmmaking, TV, YouTube world, that's probably what it means. Hopefully, I really hope that's what it means when people are talking about it, not the other thing. So there's that.
So sorry for my little unexplained jargon.
It's all good. It's all good. We just we got us film people just have to explain ourselves when we're explaining that term.
Yeah. So the other thing about the visual aspects of the film is, I think we've talked about before the orange cyan dichotomy that goes on a lot, where skin tones pretty easily skew orange or this tan orange kind of color, and shadows go blue really easily, and it makes a really nice contrast. This film kind of takes it and skews it to a green orange kind of a color, and you can see it even in the poster. But it really presents, first of all, we're in a very hot climate, so blowing out a lot of the whites kind of gives a very hot impression. And then
Do
also
we have to explain what blowing out the whites means?
No, I think we can.
It's like crushing the blacks, but the opposite. It's
the opposite.
Going over 100% with a pixel.
Yeah, but the green aspect actually gives this really kind of sickly pallor to it, and I mean it's the way you feel by the time that you're done watching it. But yeah, green is not too often used as a skew. It's only like very specifically used, like The Matrix is probably one of the most famous green skewed films out there.
Matrix,
But the other thing is the night scenes, and we talked about skewing green at night in To Catch a Thief, and this one kind of takes a different spin on it in a way, because we start our night scene for the night that the soldiers have to spend out there, essentially surrounded. But for the first part of this night sequence, we have a breather. This is one of our lulls in the film where they're not being shot at, and the characters are actually having conversation and talking and kind of catching their breath from this very intense day. And it's all blue. It's got this blue wash over it. And then at some point, the backup comes and the fighting starts again. And it almost, I'm not even sure where the transition happens, but it skews green again. A very dark and green cast comes on the whole scene, and it kind of gives this impression of night vision, even though we go into actual night vision shots, which are just all green, but it gives the whole scene this sense of a night vision war thing, which is something that we're very accustomed to anyway. So as opposed to being this kind of just arbitrary choice for Hitchcock to throw some green in the night scene, because why the heck not? This one actually has a grounding. We know why we're seeing this as green night, because in war movies, we put on night vision goggles and everything turns green anyway. So it's just really
nice, very practical choice turned dramatic.
And it doesn't strike you as odd at all. Even the switch of night from blue to green doesn't strike you as odd, which is not how the night changes color, even like as the sun is rising. But you don't think about it because it's just a very natural thing, especially once that war context comes back into view.
Yeah.
All right, but with that, let's transition into overall notes. And kind of one of the first things that I think is interesting, it's not super consequential, but all of these films start with expositional text, which is something that we haven't talked about before. We've talked about ways of presenting exposition, but it's interesting that all three of these films, which fall in very different categories, start with those expositional text frames, which is basically just, if you've ever seen a lot of old movies or whatever, they just have a couple paragraphs of setup for whatever world that we're getting into. And so all of these films require some amount of world building, whether it's just acclimating us to ancient Rome, whether it's setting us up for a hypothetical fantasy future or just putting us in a political context across the world. There is something that the general audience is not going to know that we need to learn before we can have any kind of jumping off point for the stories that we're about to experience. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can do that, but this is probably the most straightforward way to do it, because you generally want to avoid characters just kind of saying these things clunkily in dialogue. And there's a lot of conversation in screenwriting about ways to avoid that and ways to kind of hide it. But sometimes you can just, just come all out with it at the beginning and just tell your audience where you are, what you need to know, and then just move on with the rest of the movie.
Exactly. And we should talk about the fact that while Ridley Scott Ridley, has jumped around so many different genres, all of his films have kind of maintained the status of blockbuster. And it's kind of just become his lane to make big budget blockbusters, regardless of what genre or topic he's addressing. Big budget studio guy, you can trust him with the money. He's going to get you a return on your investment. That's his deal. And the nice thing about it is that he's brought this kind of a sense of deeper meaning to all of the blockbusters that he's done. It doesn't feel like a set of Transformers movies. There's some substance there. Definitely in Blade Runner, politically in Black Hawk Down for sure. And even in Gladiator, there's a large pro-democracy theme going on throughout the entire film.
And this conversation about entertainment and politics. And like we've said before about the Oscars liking stories about movies, this one won Best Picture, and it's largely about entertainment, even if it's not specifically movies.
It's about the entertainment industry from 2 centuries ago.
Right.
And oh boy, aren't we glad that we don't actually kill each other anymore on screen most of the time.
Yeah, and then, the other thing we've been talking about is just how fluid Ridley Scott is able to be in moving between genres and just picking it up and basically knocking it out of the park, because they're all so different, but he does really good in all of them. And he's got even more than these ones that we've covered. He did Kingdom of Heaven, which is another period piece set in the Crusades, I believe. He did A Good Year, which is a romantic comedy, also with Russell Crowe. He did Thelma and Louise, and just so many different kinds of movies. And he's just able to pick it up and run with it. He doesn't confine himself. Not to say that confining is kind of a negative word for it. We've looked at directors who do like Hitchcock, who did suspense films over and over and over again and just made himself better and better and better at it. Ridley Scott is just really good at putting out a quality product in a lot of different veins within the world of cinema.
Yeah, and just even from an artist perspective, I respect the fact that, he likes to push himself and try different things, and, he doesn't just do the same thing over and over and over. Not that that's bad necessarily, but, definitely as a creative person myself, although not to the caliber of Ridley Scott Ridley, which is, if you're wondering, I'm always going to call him Ridley Scott Ridley, or Scott Ridley Scott from now on, because I don't.
The director formerly known as Ridley Scott.
Yeah. But, as a creative person, I totally understand wanting to change it up and do different things, and still put your same kind of touch on the different genres that you try out.
Yeah, but it's interesting. The another element of doing the same thing in a different vein is the idea that Ridley Scott is also, to a lesser degree than Michael Bay or some others, he is a bit of a franchise director, and a lot of his more modern films have kind of jumped off of older films. He didn't direct the new Blade Runner, but he had a hand in it, obviously, from creating the original Blade Runner. He's also done the last several Alien sequels, starting with Prometheus. Although Alien is a fascinating franchise in that there's been a bunch of really big name directors have a hand in it to varying degrees of success. So it is interesting that he's kind of going back to some of the things that gave him his name at the beginning, specifically Alien being his first breakout film. But he's also got lots of other stuff going on. Again, The Martian is another sci-fi film with a very different spin on it. He did the Exodus movie, The Counselor. So even now his range is crazy. And I mean, he's 80 now, but he's still directing, and he's still got 3 works in the in pre-production that he's slated to direct, and he's just not slowing down, it looks like.
Yeah. I mean, heck, keep going, man. Take your last breath on a movie set if that's what you want to do.
Go for it.
Okay, Jonathan, so what are we doing next time on The Filmlings?
All right, Alex. Next time we have the much anticipated second round of the great Hepburn versus Hepburn debate. And so we have 2 more movies, each starring respectively Katharine Hepburn and Audrey Hepburn, in our completely pointless rivalry between the 2 fantastic and very different actresses. And this time we have left it up to you guys to decide which movies for each actress that we are going to talk about. And the results are in. Alex, what will we be watching next time?
Next time, for Team Catherine, we are going to be watching The Philadelphia Story from 1940. And for Team Audrey, we will be watching My Fair Lady from 1964, which is a very interesting matchup. One of those is a musical, and one of them is not. One of them is in color, and one of them is not. But, it'll still be a fascinating head-to-head comparison in which nothing is resolved or decided or even started. We just take the chance to revel in our enjoyment of our favorite Hepburns, and really the only 2 Hepburns I can think of, which, kind of makes them our favorite by default. But, hey, I'll take it.
Yeah, so sounds good. I will see you in the ring next time.
Oh, you're on. Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
Oh, Jonathan, I promised a story, and I haven't told it yet.
Oh, yes. Tell me the story.
Okay, so I said earlier that you typically leave a film knowing that the actors who died in it, or the characters who died in it, the actors are still fine. When I was little, I did not know that. So I came up with this little theory as a kid that the people who you saw die on screen were actually convicts on death row, who were sentenced to die in films because films need people to die in movies. Now, looking back on it, that's a really messed up theory.
Do you want to know what the best part about that theory is?
What's up?
I believe that is actually what would happen in like Elizabethan theater. They would actually replace the actor with a prisoner and kill them on stage for entertainment. I may need to fact check that, but
the responsible
Alex,
thing to do would
something.
be to look it up, but I'm not going to do it because 1, it doesn't matter too much, and 2, I like the story a lot.